This conference will now be recorded.
Right. So in order to discuss this topic of managing behavior, what is important is that we start looking firstly at our current situation and what is our kind of mindset that we do have in regards to that. Now, there's a lot of memes that kind of go around, and there's one that's shared now in regards to parenting and how parents are managing their children. And a lot of the times it can be seen in a very kind of negative light. So here's a meme you can see. It says, "Here's Sue, a 31-year-old homeschooling her children for the last 5 days. Great job, Sue. Keep it up." Now, these are kind of comical uh, memes that are there, and they can be funny, but at the same time, they can also be quite dangerous in the sense of children picking up on maybe hostility or resentment that parents may have towards children being with them for now 24 hours in the day and parents not having any free times from the children. So, so what we do need to look at is the situation that we're in at the moment with lockdown. How is it that we can start changing our mindset in order to get the best out of the situation? So it's quite important we do try and shift our mindset from a negative perspective to a positive perspective. Now, there's a lot that's been shared around about how parents can think or negative things that have happened during this pandemic and how to flip that now into a positive mindset. So we've heard things of like the masjid's closed, especially for the fathers and for the men. The masjid's closed is a negative kind of feeling to that. But then the positive is that, you know, a lot of you said now you're able to establish your mind, your homes, your children are able to pray with you. And, you know, it's turned from a negative to a positive. Similarly, maybe we know now Ramadan's coming very soon, though we probably know Taraweeh. So then other positive mindsets that have been shared is look at it as almost like it's 30 days of itikaf in the masjid, in your own home, and you're able to worship Allah more and get more time. And all of those kind of things are shared. Or generally now there is a lockdown, we're not able to go out and socialize as much. So now that means that there might be more time for reading Quran and doing all of those kind of things. So from a parenting perspective, what should be looked at is if we're now stuck at home with our children, not to be thinking in a negative way, rather it can be done in a positive way, that this is now the chance to build foundations, to build a strong relationship with your children going forward. And this is an excellent time because a lot of the time parents aren't able to give time, especially fathers, to their children. So to use this opportunity to now build solid foundations and a good relationship with the children to going forward. So if you can have that as a mindset and a kind of shift in our mindset, then inshallah we're going to be able to proceed, kind of make the most of this situation. So first of all, I wanted to start with perspectives. And I'm sure some of you have maybe already seen this before. So please feel free to unmute and answer, or at the same time, you can do in the chat. I can see there, inshallah. So here is an image. And what I would like is, feel free, it's open now. And what do you see in this image? And for those who have actually seen this before, know what it's about, maybe if you can refrain and allow those who may not necessarily know the answers. So what can you see in this image?
A woman with a fur jacket.
The woman with the jacket, yeah?
A fur jacket, yeah, and a feather on her head.
And a feather on her head. Okay. Anybody else? What do we see? Is this, you only see one woman in this picture?
You can only see an old woman.
Yeah. So somebody said it can be an old woman. And so here what you can see is in this picture, it depends on perspectives, but you can be seeing that it looks like an old woman, or it could also be a young woman. So for a lot of people who can see a young woman, they're going to see the woman's eyes here facing in this direction. And that's her chin. There's her ears, and she's looking that way. And that's like her hair and so on. And And other people, what you would see, to get that off. And for other people, you can see an old woman with the nose here. This is the nose of the old woman. And there's her mouth, and she's looking towards us. So in this picture, it can be perceived as two: a younger woman looking in the opposite, looking away from us, and then an older woman facing and looking towards us. I'm just trying to... Right. And in this image, again, feel free to jump in. What can you see in this image?
I could see a duck facing left-hand side, and I can also see a rabbit facing right-hand side.
It's definitely a rabbit.
Yeah. So you can see. So one brother mentioned, brother Nur mentioned. You can see it's a duck with its beak. Let me just get the thing pen. So here's the beak of the duck, and it's facing in that direction. And there's others that can see it as a rabbit, being this is actually the ears of the rabbit, and it's facing in the opposite direction, where you can see the eyes facing towards the right. So again, this is what we're looking at in terms of perspectives. And sometimes we can, a lot of people, some people might have straight away picked up both and seen the duck and the rabbit, or the old woman and the young woman, and others may not necessarily have seen that. They might have only seen one and not necessarily the other. So then the question comes is that we're both looking at the same image, but we could be seeing two completely opposite things. And that's what we talk about perspective. That when we're talking about managing behavior, we want to first start off with, actually, let's look at perspective. That as parents, we need to first change maybe our perspective of how we are dealing and interacting with our children. And once we can start changing the perspective and looking at things in a different way, then we can start making some progress. So for today's session, we'll start off with some ideas of how we can shift our mind and our understanding. And when we can start shifting that mind and understanding, then it will open the doors up for us to have better interaction and better dealing with children, inshallah. So now if we look at a statement that I've just put onto the screen, that when we often stop seeing our children as people and we begin to see them as a problem. And this is a statement that becomes quite real, and I think in most of our lives, on a lot of occasions, we start seeing this, even myself, that there can be occasions and times that we actually stop thinking and looking at them as people, but see them as a problem. So a bit like the meme that I shared right at the beginning of the old lady homeschooling her children, that's more of seen as a problem as opposed to seeing children as people. And I can give you an example later on, inshallah. We will start discussing how is it that we see children as a problem as opposed to people. And that's the first mind shift change we need to take. That it's easy when children are doing things and making mistakes and winding you up, or all of those kind of things that are happening, that they're all seen as problematic interactions and problematic things. But we start forgetting that they're actually human, that they're people, that they have feelings and emotions, and they're still growing up and they're still young. So we need to kind of work with that in our mind. A good example would be our reactions towards children when they do something that if an adult did, you wouldn't necessarily have the same reaction. So an example that I've used before is, just say now a cup of water or a cup of drink, an adult poured a cup of water and as they're walking to sit down, maybe to drink the water, it accidentally maybe slips out of their hand and it falls and the water spills. Now, that could be a very natural occurrence that can take place for adults very easily, and we wouldn't really think twice about that. But then if we flip it and now our young child is now got a cup of water and they've dropped it, what becomes our reaction? And a lot of the times it can be that our reaction ends up being kind of very harsh towards them, and that they're always making a mistake. Why are you dropping it? But then sometimes we're forgetting the expectations we put in onto a child. Is it that the same of that of an adult, or is it that we're always picking out on any faults and issues that a child has? Mute your background noise. So it's important that we stop seeing as the children as a problem, but start seeing them as people. So now, as we're moving on, there's a question for everybody. What do we mean by discipline? Or when we hear the word discipline, what does it mean to you? So feel free, inshallah, unmute. You can make your statement or you can write in the chat. So what does discipline mean? Or what do we mean by discipline?
Alaikum.
Salam.
Yeah, to me, discipline, like when it comes to obviously kids, bringing them up the correct way, but being fair and just.
Okay.
That's what
So
it means.
okay, in the correct way, but being fair and just. Has anybody else got another maybe definition?
Like for example, like as a parent, also being a good role model while you're disciplining, because when sometimes you do it yourself. I myself, like, say if my child is shouting and I'll be like, why are you shouting? You are not supposed to shout. And then I realize I'm actually shouting the command myself. And then I'll be like, all right, sorry. So it's like apologizing when you've done, taking responsibility as well.
Okay, that's great, inshallah. Some other points in the chat I can see as well. Somebody mentioning beating, teaching them a lesson, putting things into perspective, being strict, having a routine in place and following it strictly, being a good inspiration for them as children, application of setting ground rules. A lot of time discipline has a negative connotation. So that's a very good point. Or a negative connotation. Or discipline can usually come when they do something wrong. So it would be punishment for doing something wrong. So there's quite a few different points in regards to what is discipline. But I think, inshallah, one of the brothers has got a good point already. The one mentioned training rules and behavior. So if we look at a statement here by Dr. Brian Gilmer, who has a PhD in human behavior, and this is something he explained regarding disciplining. And this is actually something that falls in line of what we refer to disciplining within the Islamic perspective. He mentioned that the act of disciplining a child can be a frustrating one. However, at the outset, it needs to be stressed that disciplining means education. Discipline is essentially program guidance that helps people to develop internal self-control, self-direction, and efficiency. If it is to work, discipline requires mutual respect and trust. On the other hand, punishment requires external control over a person by force and coercion. Punishing agents seldom respect or trust the one punished. So here, we can see very clearly that when we use the term, and what I will be using through this process, when we talk about discipline, discipline actually means education. That what we're trying to do is build something within our child that becomes a means, a mechanism of internal self-control. So when a child does something wrong, we are educating them that this is wrong, or before they do it, we're educating them that this is wrong. So we know, for example, if your two children are now bickering and one of them hits another one, we will tell them, no, this is not correct behavior. So we're educating them. That's what it means. It means you're educating them in order so they know the right self-control to have so they know that hitting is wrong. They know that lying is wrong and stealing is wrong and so on and so on. And the discipline process we're doing, it should be education. Because on the long term, you want your child to develop that self-control internally, that when they're on the wrong, they know that this is right and that is wrong. Because your child will grow up and they'll go out into the wider world. And in that wider world they go into, you're not always going to be there to hold their hands and to guide them. So therefore, it's important that your child develops that self-control, self-direction, the values that you instill within your child to know what is right and what is wrong. Sometimes legally there might be something that's right and wrong, but then we know, as additionally within our faith, within the values that we hold within our religion and in our homes, that there are things that we may say this is not acceptable behavior or this is wrong, though in society it may be practiced. Like, for example, your child is now past the age of 18 and they can drink alcohol, but we know that this is not right. So therefore, building that discipline within the child, that's what it means, the education process, so they know what that is. And in fact, by discipline, we shouldn't be thinking of punishment, because a lot of the times when we talk about discipline, we think punishment. And that isn't necessarily the case. Discipline, if our mindset from the beginning is discipline is education, then the way we approach it will be different. The moment we think discipline is only punishment, that means we'll always use excessive force and external force. So like it says towards the end, as Dr. Brian mentions here, that external control over the person. Because we're the adult, because we're stronger, because we're bigger, we can exert that external control. And a lot of the time, the one who then coercively punishes, they have no or little respect for the one that they're punishing. So that's the mind shift change you take. And when we talk about discipline, what we're actually talking about is educating our children. So we've talked a bit about that external power and pressure that can be applied onto the child. So the question is are we effective in our teaching if we use power to punish? What are our thoughts around that? Are we being effective in teaching if we use power to punish? So here by power, we're talking about we've got that control, we've got the authority and the power. Is it going to be effective? If you say yes, then why? If it's a no, also I'd like to hear why, maybe. I know in the chat we've got some no's already, but some explanations of maybe why. No, because you can never always. Yeah.
I was going to say, because it'll only get you short-term results if you exert power, because obviously you're kind of bigger, stronger, and have authority over them when they're younger and smaller. But then when they come of age, then that will no longer work. So it's kind of doomed to fail.
Yeah. That's right, and I think you've kind of hit the nail really on the head. And some of them mentioning no because no, but I would raise a question I would like to raise is, how do you control your own behavior and emotions? Okay, we're going to deal with that very soon, inshallah. AK. No, it makes them rebel. No, because one day they will have more power as we will grow old. And I think that is a reoccurring point, which is that power is limited. Control is limited. And the fear that we can put into the child is limited for a certain period of time. And eventually it will come to a point where that power will no longer be effective. Also, what you have to understand is as we keep on using power to control our children, that what does it do to the relationship we have with our children? Because as that relationship is growing, it's not a relationship of mutual respect, of trust that's being built, of love. Rather, it's this coercive external power that's doing it. You could almost say it's quite similar to a tyrant. So a tyrant or a dictator who uses force to coerce and to ensure that his people are listening, are obeying, they're being subjugated. So similarly, that's what ends up happening as parents. We end up doing. And one of the key questions that tends to come up a lot, or a key worry for a lot of the parents, is that in the teenage years is when they worry about. They worry about their child during the teenage years and the process of rebellion, the opening to so much more evil and wrongdoing that they could get up to. And so what is really important, that if we can build a relationship prior to those years, then you have a better chance going through those years. And if we're using, like I said, a power to punish, then it's not going to have the best effect. And like you said, once the power has gone, once you've reached old age, or once your child has grown up to become effective, more powerful than you, or less scared of you, how do you think your child will now behave? Because now that power is gone, that coerced them in order to obey you is gone now. So how will they then respond? But if there is mutual trust and respect, then power can be equal, and respect is there. And there was a famous, I don't have it here, but there was a famous statement of Fudayl ibn Iyad, who said that love is better than fear. And he gave a good analogy of a master and his slaves. So if there is a master and he has a slave, and one of the slaves, basically he uses force and power and fear. So what happens is, in his presence, that slave is dutiful and obedient to him. But the moment that that master is absent, the slave will then curse him, maybe stab him behind his back, steal from him, do all of those things. But if a relationship between a master and a slave is loving, then the slave will love the master in his presence, and he will also love him in his absence. And so that very good relationship there, obviously he was making reference to relations between Allah the Creator and us as the slaves. But we can apply that within our parenting realms, that if the relationship is built on love, trust, and mutual respect, then when we are absent, a child will also still fall in line and behave to the expected norms that we have set, which is really mainly from our deen. So that's the kind of relationship that needs to kind of take place. So there's quite a few points here. So I'm just trying to catch up on any other questions, and then we'll move on. Yeah, it says here again, children need to understand what is right and wrong, and when they do something wrong, to explain if it's the deed that is done, not themselves.
Flying dinosaur.
No, you said, Mummy.
Mute. Cool. Yep, and any punishment should be done, should be to show what has been done is wrong, not brutal and horrible. Yeah, so we'll talk about what we mean by punishment a bit later, inshallah. So now, what is an important point is, while we understand that discipline means education, a discipline shouldn't necessarily be us just coercively using force and power. Rather, if we think it's education, we use a different approach and means. The next one is when we do want to discipline our children, and we mean teaching and instruction as education, but effective discipline, which is teaching and instruction, cannot happen when emotions are high. And that becomes a very, very important point, that I think one of the sisters mentioned it before, that whenever we now sometimes are trying to get our children to behave or act in a certain way, that if we're also in a heightened state of emotion, which is anger or frustration and so on, then no effective disciplining can really take place at that time. Meaning disciplining, meaning education, as we said. They're not going to learn if we are doing that. So similarly, if we want them not to shout and we shout at them to tell them not to shout, it kind of defeats the objective. So it is really important that we look at how our situation and our emotions at the time when we're trying to discipline. And I think one of the things that Stephen Covey, who wrote The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, and he wrote a similar book called 7 Habits of Highly Effective Families. And he mentions in there about hitting the pause button, as what he calls it. So you're in a very high, tense situation, and something's happening. You could react to it, but instead, what do? Is you shouldn't react. We should act and not react. In order to act, that means we need to pause ourselves, because a lot of the times when something's happening in a heated situation, we react straight away. We do something, we're reacting straight away. Rather, you hit the pause button, and then that pause button could be that we take ourselves away from the situation. We calm ourselves down, we think rationally, and then we act. Because then we can say that action that we have taken is actually a bit more sound, a bit more logical, and not based on emotions. So it's really important to remember that if we're in a heightened state of emotions, then it's best not to do anything thinking that we're trying to discipline or educate them. Rather, actually, it's going to be the opposite. Our actions will be impulsive, and we don't want them to be impulsive. We need them not to be reactive, but then to be proactive. So again, another mindset shift that we need to take place. Another key point that we have to take into consideration is that if we wish to discipline our children effectively, we must practice what we preach. So, we have maybe great or high expectations of our children. Our child comes into the world and we may have certain expectations. We want them to become the greatest in many areas. We want them to become, say, a hafiz of Quran. We want to become grounded in knowledge, to become ulama, to become du'at, to become leaders in different fields. And we want all of these good things to come out from our children and have high expectation standards. We want them to have excellent morals and manners and our conduct. But the only way our children can get that is if we are also standing on higher ground, meaning that we can't be low in the gutter and then expect great things from our child. Because, as I said, children, they follow the actions of our parents, of the adults. And if we do not practice what we preach, then our children won't follow us. And it's a famous statement that's been said many a times. Lead by example, practice what you preach. There are different ways that I've mentioned. And there's a theory, what is called the modeling theory within child psychology, and its definition is that there's a tendency of younger children to copy what they see in adults. And one thing is quite clear is that children, they don't listen well, they observe better, and they actually end up following what you do and not necessarily what you say. So you can't ever turn around to your child and say, do as I say, not as I do. Rather, what your actions, they speak louder than words. So you need to ensure that whatever high moral standards you want of your child, that you need to be as yourself. So you have to ensure that whatever great standards you want for your child, you're also doing that. So it's an important reflection for ourselves. What are our habits? So if we want your child to establish Salah in their life, how is our Salah? If you want your child to establish Quran in their life, how is your Quran? And so it always goes back to yourself first. Start with yourself and then we can go outwards. If you want them to model good behavior interactions with their siblings, then how are you in your interactions with your children and with your family? And all of those things they see. And so it's a very, very important thing that we have to remember. Everything starts with us. Good parenting will start from how you do it. What are your habits and how you do things? Another key, again, point to discuss is expectations of children. And each child, and sometimes we forget this, that a child is only a child. A child is still fully growing. They haven't fully developed yet. They take years, and it says into the 20s is when they have fully completed their development. So that means before that, the child is still learning and developing. They are not fully functional, you could say. So we have to measure our expectation of our children. And so we have to allow and know that children need to develop certain abilities. They won't have the ability straight away. They develop certain abilities. And that some children take longer than others in order to achieve or develop those abilities. So have a balance and a balanced expectation of your child. Now, a good analogy would be that would you expect your 12-year-old child to be able to know how to drive a car fully? You get him into the car and say, here you go, here's my keys, now drive. And then when the child says, I don't know how to do it, or starts failing, then we become frustrated with the child. And think, why can't you do it? Is that a measured expectation of our child? Or another example would be of our child, a 15-year-old child, and you're asking them to complete a tax return form. Adults can't even do tax return forms. But then when the child struggles to do this, you then again become angry. Why is it that you can't do it? Are these measured expectations? And so that's an important thing that we have to reflect on, that our expectations of our child need to be measured. That a child is growing and not every child is the same. And so we have to make sure that whenever we are developing or instructing, helping our child grow, that the expectations are measured. Like I said, would you expect a 2-year-old to go in and make a cup of tea? You know, if they fail, what will happen? So it's all of those kind of things. And it goes back to that first point I mentioned, that sometimes we stop seeing our children as people and see them as a problem. Rather, we should see them as people and little people, and that they're developing and they're growing and that they're only a child. And then if we keep that on the forefront of our mind, then that will help in measuring our expectations and our reactions and interactions with our child. And another kind of key thing that needs to be kind of looked at is with children, sometimes children behave in a certain way because they don't actually know what the rules and expectations are. And if you haven't explained to your child the rules and expectations and the expected behavior of their behavior, or expectations of their behavior, then you can't blame them for failing. So it's a given one, but sometimes we might forget, and you think that the child should know how they should behave in a certain situation or a certain setting, and they aren't. And because of that, we then start losing our temper with them. So what is important is that we actually explain it to them first. And there are some things that, inshallah, hopefully next week we're going to be covering a section on this, but knowing what are the values of your home, what are the values of your family, you know, what is it that, so does your child know that? Because the values are effectively your rules and your expectations on your child. So it's important that the child knows what are the values. And inshallah, we'll discuss this next week in terms of creating values within the home, looking at family mission statements, looking at creating the foundations of relationships that we can build on, or the building blocks for those relationships. Inshallah, we'll look at that next week. But it's an important point to remember now, that we have to ensure that the child knows what's expected of them. So while this period of lockdown has happened, are your children aware of how the day will go? Do they have, like, for example, a timetable? Are they aware that this is what they should be doing, what they shouldn't be doing? Because if they just wake up and then suddenly they start doing things and they're misbehaving, and then you're getting angry with them, but they don't know, they weren't aware, and you never informed them that this is what was expected of them, and because of that they behave in a certain way. So we should again measure our expectations of our children, inshallah. And this is the last point on this section we'll cover, which is sometimes we need to also explore the reasons behind the way the child is behaving. And sometimes there can be very deep, painful, and important issues that are behind the behavior of the child. And if we just go away and threaten and we bribe them in order for them to behave, we're kind of just sweeping the issue under the rug. And there could be something quite more deep, like I said, and painful underneath that. But sometimes the child is misbehaving. We tell them, if you don't do this, that's what's going to happen. So the threat's gone. Or we tell them, oh, if you behave, I'll give you this. And the child's like, oh, okay, whatever. And then they kind of fall into line. But in that process, maybe there are things that are much more deeper that need to be dealt with. Now, this is an example I've used before, and these are actually cases, real cases. But sometimes it could be the case you expect, for example, family members to come round, and when they do, your children maybe give them salam or give them a hug. And maybe an uncle comes around and your child doesn't give this uncle a hug, and then you force them to give them a hug. But sometimes there could be underlying issues that are there. Sometimes a child may not want to hug a person because they've had an uncomfortable interaction with this adult sometime before. And there are many issues like that and cases like that where of child abuse that could be taking place. Again, parents are oblivious and unaware of it, but they're forcing the child to behave or conform to a certain expectation without knowing that there's an underlying issue and a harm that's there. And there's many other times that children can suffer from trauma. Classic examples of when the child loses a loved one. And a lot of the time, a child reacts to this trauma in different ways. So sometimes they can become more violent and they lash out. They start getting into fights, uncharacteristic behavior. And so those things can end up happening. Sometimes they can start dropping academically. They rebel, they can self-harm. There's so many things that happen, and it's important that we start seeing what the behavior is, and sometimes we need to go behind the reason of the behavior in order to understand what's really happening. and not think they're just basically being silly, they're being disruptive. So for that, inshallah, we'll just give a quick summary of those bits that we discussed in regards to this about disciplining. Firstly, disciplining means education. And that's what that should be our mindset from the onset, that when we're trying to discipline our child, we want to educate them. That using power to punish will eventually end as a deterrent. It will come to an end. Now, effective discipline cannot happen when the emotions are high. That we must practice what we preach. So modeling, we talked about how children observe and they follow and they see what you do. Children need to develop certain capabilities. Some take longer than others. Children are not mind readers, so it's important that we explain to them what is acceptable behavior. And lastly, we should explore the possible reasons behind their behavior. So these are all things that we need to do as parents. It's a mind shift. It's a bit more, not necessarily practical, and we'll look into some practical things towards the end of today's session. But before that, it's important that we start shifting our mind and how we see things, and then we can, inshallah, open up and actually work positively towards having better relationships, inshallah. Now I want to look into the next part, which is look at this hadith. So this is a hadith of Anas radiallahu anhu. Those who know Anas radiallahu anhu is a young Sahabi who spent many years under the guardianship of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam as a child. And he said here in this hadith, he said, the Messenger of Allah had the best disposition among people. One day he sent me on an errand, and I said, by Allah, I will not go. But it was in my mind that I would do as the Messenger of Allah had ordered me. I went until I came upon children playing in the street. Then the Messenger of Allah arrived, and he caught me by the back of my neck from behind. As I looked up at him, I found him smiling, and he said, Unais, which is a nickname for Anas, did you go where I asked you to go? I said, O Messenger of Allah, yes, I am going. So just reflecting very briefly on this hadith, you can see the example of the Prophet ﷺ, that Anas being a child, the Prophet asked him to do something and he actually didn't want to do it. You can see, he said, by Allah, I won't go. But then he realized he should do it, it's the Messenger of Allah, so then he went. And naturally, as children, sometimes we send them on an errand or a task, they will get distracted. He saw some other children playing, he got distracted, losing track of time. The Prophet comes to him. Now, he could be angry. We think of our situation. We might have come and said, I told you, how many times do I have to tell you again? And we might lose our cool and our temper. But in this situation, he kept it very calm. He smiled at him. And he didn't tell him, why didn't you do this? Rather, he said, did you go? So he took the positive approach, not the negative, thinking straight away, I'm condemning you. You didn't do it, did you? Sometimes that can be our mindset. Yeah, we know you did. I know you didn't do it. But in fact, it was the opposite. I asked him, did you do it? Give him the benefit of the doubt. And then he said, no, I didn't. I'm going to go now. And you see how the Prophet ﷺ dealt with a child in that situation. It's very natural for them to get distracted and to move away and lose vision of what the task that they've given them. So it's a very important thing to remember, and we take example from the Prophet ﷺ. So then the question comes in, why is it that we yell at our children? Why do we yell? And if we can work out this answer, inshallah, then that will help us in order to get to a bit more clarity as to why. So again, it's a question to brothers and sisters here. Please feel free to answer. Why is it? Why do we yell at our children? What makes us yell at our children?
Can I have a go at answering this question?
Yes, okay. Go ahead.
I think most of the time, not just with children, but at any point, whether we're driving, when we feel like we can't control the situation, and our emotions take over, I think that's when we choose to yell. We choose to act before we think. I think personally myself, I've fallen that. So yeah, I think when we feel like things are out of our control, and we don't use our rational thinking, rather our emotions take over, I think that's when we choose
Yeah, that's very much on point. I feel that sometimes what ends up happening is we lose control. I'm just seeing time is short, so I'll move on. But it's something that we refer to as a parent tantrum. We have it all the time. I have it. We all have it. But we have that breakdown that we lose ourselves. And apologies, a lot of points. So let's go back. So what ends up happening is, and under parent tantrum, there's three key points. One is sometimes the parent has a tantrum, they lose control, they yell because parents don't know what to do. The situation has arisen, they just don't know what to do, so you yell. Another one is that the parent becomes so frustrated that they can't see straight. Like you completely lose, so situations or things around you make that happen. And another part of parental tantrum is that sometimes the parent might actually have an anger management problem, and because of that, they're doing it. And these are they're very generic, but usually one or another, it falls into that. Yeah, you might want your child to do something, but the child doesn't do it, and then you don't know what to do about it, so you have a tantrum. You don't know how to deal with the situation, so you have a tantrum. You don't know how to kind of get through that, so you have a tantrum. So a lot of the times, because someone mentioned somebody want quick results, all of these are byproducts. But really, at the end of it, it comes down to why do you end up shouting? Is because really you don't know what to do because the child is not listening to you because of they haven't done the task quick enough because of whatever it is. It boils down to you don't know what to do about it, or you're so frustrated you can't see straight, or you might have an anger management issue. So if we look at it, we should be very clear and we should know that most children are in no way deaf or hard of hearing. Obviously, most children, obviously, unless a child has a hearing impairment, generally speaking, children aren't deaf. They're not hard of hearing. And we know that sometimes we tell them to do a task, so they don't do it. And that's probably because they become so cultured. Sometimes it can be because they become so cultured that they only do a task when you shout at them, that they wait for you to shout and then they do the task. And so because of that, they've got so used to it and so trained and cultured into doing that. The other thing is, sometimes if you look at the example, they're not hard of hearing because a child, if you were to now be within earshot of them, and maybe to husband to the wife or the wife to the husband, whisper something like, oh, should we get some ice cream or maybe some chocolate or maybe we should give them some money and so on. You're going to see straight away your child's ears will pick up like satellite dishes and radars. They just suddenly pick up and then they listen. That means they're not deaf. They're not hard of hearing, and they're not necessarily. It just means that we know they're not deaf. So then, how is it that we can ensure that we get our children to actually listen? And like I said, sometimes children have stopped listening because we've been always constantly yelling at them and they've got used to that. Other times it's actually because we haven't actually explained it to them correctly. So one of the ways that if you can do is to build that. And I'm only, again, in our session, there's only so much you can cover. There's only so little bits that you can actually really fully cover. But here is one of them is sometimes we can try and speak to our children softly and calmly and kindly, and your children will be more likely to respond positively. So if you were to come down to their level and in a soft and gentle manner, you explain to them, you give them the instructions that you want. And because you've now showed them respect by not shouting at them, but coming down to their level, by being soft and kind and showing, like I said, showing them respect, that they're probably, and also now because you've said it literally face to face and they've connected with your eyes, that they can't ignore your command and that they can kind of move on and do that command. And this is just one technique. It might not necessarily always work, but again, it's something to think about, that we can try and build a relationship that is around respect with the child. And if you speak to them in that way, as opposed to shouting at them, because we might have got into such a habit of always yelling commands, rather try this approach, and maybe that might be a way that might help. Another kind of mind shift that we need to look at is look at the world through their eyes. So remember, we looked at right at the beginning that those two pictures, that in a picture, there are two images effectively. We could be looking at the same picture, but seeing different things. So sometimes that's what's happening. A child is seeing something, and then we're seeing something else. So we can change that, look at the world through their perspective, look at the world through their eyes. So a lot of this is about empathy, about caring and not scaring, you know, listening to understand. Sometimes we need to be heard and listened. So it's very important that we do try and see how we can try and do that. And an important thing is, when we talk about shouting as well, and we know as adults that when we shout, people switch off. As adults, we do the same thing. That we have, if an adult shouts at us, how responsive are we necessarily to that adult? We sometimes switch off, we go into a defensive mode. So similarly, a child will do the same thing, that when you shout at them, they go into a defensive mode. And they won't listen, and everything goes off. So all it does is, by us shouting, it's just signified to the child and to the individual that we've just lost control of the situation, and we're no longer in control of our situation. So it's very important that we look at that. At the moment we shout, we've actually lost control of the situation. And we know many hadith that talk about anger, and shouting comes from anger. So it's important we go back and reflect on that. If we can control that, then we can have a better chance of building those relationships and building more obedient children around that as well. And with this last kind of point, inshallah, we're going to look at, so how can we avoid yelling? So how can we avoid yelling? Sometimes there's a few things that we can do, that when we are discussing with our children, sometimes we start yelling at them because we want some certain tasks to be done by a certain time, and they're not done. So if we give enough head time beforehand to the child, and they're able to know, and they're able to actually do that in time. An example may be that dinner's going to get ready, and you want to make sure your children are ready for dinner. So beforehand, to give them an announcement, to tell them that dinner's going to be ready in 10 minutes. So then the child knows, okay, they've got 10 minutes to finish what they're doing, to get right, to get to kind of make sure that they've got everything ready. And then you explain it to a child that dinner's going to be ready in 10 minutes. I expect you to be ready on the table with hands washed, ready to eat while the food is warm. You've given clear, concise instructions and information. And the more you do that, the more the child has got all the information required for them to understand. Sometimes a child just doesn't understand why they have to stop playing now and have dinner now. So they become an important thing. And a kind of a last point is that sometimes our interaction with our child is always just instruction, telling them do this, do that, or telling them off for not doing something. So the more we can have more conversations with our children that are not on that basis, that could be about other things, then it's important that we do start doing and that having a lot more interactions with people, with our children, that isn't necessarily instructions or departing and all of those kind of instructions, or correcting them and all of those kind of things. So it's an important thing that we do need to look at, inshallah. And with that, inshallah, I'll end just today's session, and we'll look at some more tips, inshallah, next week, and covering a different section next week, inshallah. And that's it. With that, we'll conclude. Unfortunately, just out of time at the moment to take any of the questions, because I'm sorry, there's another session that I need to join in that starts at 9. But what we can do is, as I mentioned, there is a WhatsApp group that has been created. I'm just going to now share the link of that WhatsApp group. So again, mothers can join the mothers group, and fathers can join the fathers group, inshallah. I've just sent it in the chat. There's a link there. It's called bit.ly/mothers101. The other one is /fathers101, inshallah. And with that, you can join those WhatsApp group, inshallah, and we can continue some of those discussions within the group, inshallah. And in terms of questions regarding the handouts for today's session, inshallah, I can try and share that within the WhatsApp group. So please do join those WhatsApp groups. So there's one for the mothers, one for the fathers, inshallah. I've just dropped it in the chat. It's bit.ly/mothers101, the numbers 101. And the other one is bit.ly/fathers101. So please do join that. Inshallah, the sessions are recorded and I'll put them up hopefully onto the Facebook, and they're already up on the Instagram, inshallah. Apologies, time is very short, but you can only get an hour session in. So next week, inshallah, I'll try to cut it down a bit more to allow a bit more time for question and answers, inshallah. And we'll end it there then. Subhanakallah wa bihamdika ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. Jazakallah khair for everybody joining in, and inshallah tune in for next week. We'll start next week at 8:15, inshallah. Because Maghrib is about 8 o'clock, so we'll start at 8:15 inshallah. Shukran. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.